for fostering development, for lifting people out of poverty. The greatest success stories in fighting poverty today are China and India and their economic growth, which is driven by trade. We all recognize the power trade has to lift people out of poverty. Do we agree? Yes. We all also agree that Western, more developed economic countries can do things to foster development. For example, scrap the common agricultural policy, reduce tariffs and trade barriers to imports from less developed countries. Again, do we agree? Yes, we're all in agreement here. Where the disagreements begin is what policies should the less developed countries follow. Because on our side of the house, we believe that LDCs should also practice free trade, whereas on the other side of the house, they believe that LDCs really shouldn't. That LDC primary sectors, agriculture in particular, should be subsidized by Western consumers. Do you disagree with my summary thus far?
I'm sure you've heard that the governments of least developed countries are not imposing tariffs, are not imposing quotas. They're simply allowing producers within their territorial jurisdiction to enter into voluntary trade agreements.
Yeah, it's fine. I'm not saying they should in any way restrict trade. I'm just saying we believe on our side that we should leave the market to sort out, the economies in LDCs as well. And you think Western consumers should somehow subsidize farmers in the less developed nations.
Isn't that a market intervention, though?
Fine. As far as I can understand, I asked my two colleagues from Fairtrade tonight, what exactly is it that Fairtrade does? And the answer I got was basically that Fairtrade has a minimum price at which it purchases food crops, correct? Yes? And establishing this minimum price has, they believe, lots of benefits. Farmers get a better price for their products, they can invest the extra money they get, and so forth. Are we agreed on that?
No, you haven't quite understood it, I'm sorry. But I can address it later.
Fine. Let us take that as at least a general idea behind Fairtrade. Now, there are lots of subtleties that go into this, into how Fairtrade is actually implemented, and Professor Henderson talked about those. But I don't want to talk about the subtleties. I don't want to talk about the implementation. I want to talk about the concept itself. Because I think the central concept of what Fairtrade is trying to do is counterproductive. I believe it is very appealing. It is very appealing, but it is counterproductive. In the short term, it will benefit a small number of farmers, but it will harm more. And in the long term, it will in fact harm practically all farmers in the less developed world. And therefore, although it is done with the best of intentions, it is unfair to producers. I will later argue that it is also unfair to consumers. Now, sorry, what's his name again? Mike. Mike argued that Fairtrade could not possibly be unfair because it was voluntary, but this is a specious argument. If you tell people that, look, this will help you, and they believe you, and they undertake this course of action, and taking that course of action ends up hurting them, then that's pretty unfair too. And I believe that Fairtrade is unfair for this very reason. Now, the major plank of Fairtrade is that they have this minimum price which they purchase goods at. Let us say coffee, bananas, whatever. And I believe this will hurt a lot more people than it will help in the short run. Let us think why. Let us assume that we make a thought experiment where we start off with a functioning, competitive market, right? People can produce coffee and people can buy coffee. Now, if the demand for coffee is greater than the supply, there will be a shortage, so the price will rise, so more people will produce coffee, and the market will come into equilibrium.
This is ridiculous. The markets that you're talking about are not competitive open market.
I was going to address that. If we introduce a fair trade minimum price which we produce at, then for this minimum price to have any meaning, it has to be higher than the market price, right? Now, if, let's say, market price is $100 and the fair trade offered price is $110, well, what happens? All of a sudden, a lot more producers want to produce coffee because they're drawn to this $110 price. Look, we can get $110 for coffee. Let's make more coffee. Fine, except if everybody's producing coffee at the level they would produce, more people are producing coffee than would under a free market. Less people want coffee because the price of coffee has gone up. And the net result is that there is a surplus of coffee on the market. More coffee is being produced than there is demand for. That's inevitable, I think.
Could I ask you to address why, for most of the past 15 years, there have been an excessive production of about 10 to 15% on coffee over the demand, when in fact during that period Fairtrade accounted for less than 0.5%. Assuming our 0.5% was all overproduction, how do you account for the other 14.5%?
Governments.
I'm not an expert in the coffee market. I will defer that to my colleagues.
Well, you would agree that this is theory rather than...
Sir, this is my speech and not yours. I have already said I am not arguing the nitty-gritties, I am arguing the concept. And
That was very nitty-gritty.
As a matter of principle, establishing a minimum price that you purchase at will lead to a surplus of coffee, or whatever product there is. You would expect there to be a surplus of coffee. So all the people that are not selling to Fairtrade suddenly don't have anywhere to sell to. They will have to sell at a lower price. So everybody that isn't Fairtrade will be getting a lower price for their products, because the people that are Fairtrade are getting a higher price. And the people that are getting a lower price for their products are inevitably worse off. It's unfair to them. In the medium term, the adoption of fair trade is unfair because it encourages inefficiency in agricultural production. Fair trade supports cooperatives, and it specifically supports cooperatives that pursue labor-intensive methods of production. In other words, fair trade encourages people to produce goods in labor-intensive and inefficient ways. It discourages farms to move towards mechanization and to improve their economic efficiency, because if they improve their efficiency, they will no longer qualify for fair trade. If they mechanize, they will no longer command the higher fair trade price. Therefore, fair trade provides an incentive to people to pursue inefficient economic practices. It encourages inefficient production, which is bad in the long term because people can produce less, they can earn less, and therefore it is unfair. And lastly, tonight, fair trade is unfair, I believe, in the long term, because in the long term, fair trade subsidizes people to stay in agriculture when we should be encouraging them to get out of it. No country has ever developed by specializing in agriculture. The path of economic development is clear. The majority of people have to move away from agriculture and into industry and services. Now, by adopting fair trade, we are trying to set up a situation where more people can get a comfortable, not desperately poor, but still pretty poor, living out of agriculture. We are subsidizing agriculture. We are making agriculture viable for a large segment of the population. And by doing this, we are encouraging a very large number of people to stay in agriculture. If fair trade works, if the whole world buys into fair trade, more people will remain in agriculture than would have stayed in agriculture otherwise, because they're getting higher prices out of it. And this, in the long term, is counterproductive. It's a bad idea. We don't want people to stay in agriculture, to stay in labor-intensive small farms, tilling the land for coffee and bananas. We want them to move to industry, to services, and the whole fair trade idea discourages this. And therefore, in the long term, I believe it hinders economic development. It hinders the development of the economy. And I believe this is unfair in the long term because